Hello, I'm Martha Engber, host of Vigilant Positivity, a blog and podcast meant to decrease polarization by uniting Americans through civil discussion that leads to common ground. Thanks to those of you who've tuned in. Please feel free to subscribe and grow the Common Ground movement. Every month, I do a citizen spotlight to cast a light on other Americans on both sides of the political spectrum who are working hard to decrease polarization. Today, I'm talking with Aanya Ujjval. Hello, Aanya.
Hey.
Aanya is 17, lives in Austin, Texas, and is the National Policy Director for the High School Democrats of America. A first-generation American of Indian ancestry, she volunteers and advocates to increase youth involvement in the political process. She develops comprehensive research documents to guide policy and hosts webinars with influential political candidates and politicians to spur youth activism. She served as the only high schooler under 20 state representative for Braver Angels, a national nonprofit organization that serves to heal the political divide. Additionally, Aanya is the incoming Texas chapter president for the American Youth Association, a bipartisan organization working to draft and introduce legislation in legislatures. In May, she won the Tulane University Book Award, given to outstanding high school junior who demonstrates exceptional academic achievement, leadership, and commitment to service. The previous fall, she won the President's Gold Volunteer Service Award for her contributions to volunteer service. Aanya, the President's Gold Volunteer Service Award is awarded through AmeriCorps, a federal agency that offers opportunities for people like you and I to serve on our communities. Can you describe the when and where of receiving the award and, more importantly, how you felt during the event?
Yes. So, hi everyone. My name is Anya once again, and it is true that I received the President's Volunteer Service Award. So I got the gold edition of this award, which means over 200 hours of volunteer service in 1 year. And to qualify for this award, I had to qualify through an organization. So I qualified through my debate team, which meant that at least 40% of my awards of my community service hours did come from debate. However, the other 60% came from other organizations and other things that I've done. For example, my volunteering in teen court, my service through to our nation through High School Democrats and AOIA and other organizations that Martha described a little bit more in the introduction. So I received this during fall semester, towards the end of fall semester last year. And it was genuinely such an honor. I was one of two kids to initially from my school get this award for our service and from the debate team, of course. So this felt really important to me. It kind of was like commemorating my service to my country, and I received the award from a president who I've long respected for a really long time. So it made me feel really great, and it kind of like helped me feel a little bit more committed to my community and continuing to do community service work.
And it was presented at your high school, or did you travel somewhere to receive it?
Oh, it was sent in the mail to the sponsor, which was my debate coach, and then we just hung it on the wall in the debate room.
Oh, very nice. Okay, so no all expenses paid trip to Washington, D.C. or such.
Unfortunately not.
Well, what moment, event, or person woke you to the need to call your fellow youth to political action?
I didn't say that it was exactly a moment. I feel like it was more of a culmination of a lot of moments. So it just kind of struck me one day. I was sitting on my phone just doom scrolling on Instagram, like a lot of teenagers my age do. And I kind of just like kept seeing stories of people talking about Palestine and Bangladesh and a lot of conflicts happening around the world. And I thought this was really interesting. I thought that it was good that people were getting involved in politics rather than saying, oh, politics isn't really for me. I don't do politics. So it's definitely better than that. But I did feel like a lot of these people were being performative, right? Reposting for the sake of reposting, not really knowing what was going on, what the conflict between Israel, Iran, and Palestine was really about. So I think that like and all of these people like when questioned about it with like basic questions like what does from the river to the sea, what does it mean? They wouldn't really know. So I feel like this kind of like sparked an idea in my mind like wow, some people really are performative activists. And I've always like through High School Democrats, AYA, and my own nonprofit tried to promote like productive youth activism. So this is something that I try to practice and something that I've like tried to help others practice. And I guess that was kind of like the starting moment because I think that a lot of these arguments and the things that they're saying are really good ideas, but it gets kind of like washed down and watered out. Watered down and washed out when they don't really know what they're talking about. And there's no point in believing something or thinking you believe something if you can't convince others of it. So I think that like being knowledgeable in everything you do is really important, at least to me. And I wanted to help other youth kind of be able to model that themselves.
So know what you're talking about rather than just reposting.
Yes, exactly.
What are the issues that really concern you at this point, and you feel it's absolutely necessary to solve if you and this generation is going to have a really bright future?
Honestly, what immediately comes to mind is things like polarization and campaign finance reform. But I feel like the root cause of all of that is misinformation, things that I talked about in my previous answer, how people don't really know exactly what they're talking about. And if they did, they would know a lot more. For example, a lot of people come from families where their entire, like for generations, they've all believed the same party platform, party line, and they don't really explore anything outside of that. They just teach themselves the same phrases to repeat, kind of like the same things that they're meant to believe. And I think that like if people branched out a little bit more and really thought about what the other side of the aisle was saying, if people really tried to be educated about global politics and things on the news, for example, the recent Iran-Israel war that is continuously going on even right now, and the US is involved. A lot of global powers are involved. If people really knew the facts, the statistics, and could make decisions on their own, I feel like that would help a lot of people out and we would realize that we're not really as different as we seem. For example, at ALA Girl State, which is a program where we role play government, we had to introduce bills and legislation a lot. So a lot of things I was noticing is people had to do their own research on all of these bills. They couldn't just be like, oh, this is sponsored by Republican, which means I'm automatically voting for it. Or this is sponsored by Democrat, I'm automatically voting for it. Things like that. So people had to find their own statistics, and they people would find like, wait a minute, even though this is on my party's platform, I don't necessarily agree with it. So people were kind of branching out from their own political ideologies, and I thought that that was really powerful. So like research and education is the most important thing. So the biggest obstacle I feel like is misinformation, and the biggest tool to combat that is education.
It is something the misinformation is across the board and it's rampant and it's only going to get worse through AI. Do you really think, education can combat that?
I think that like it has to be a combination of education and legislation when it comes to AI. I think that certain aspects of AI must be regulated. I mean, things like deep fakes and revenge deep fakes that are literally ruining people's lives. Senators across the nation are trying to target this. For example, Representative Lalani from Austin, someone that I've really been inspired by for a while. He recently passed a deep fakes bill that bans them, which kind of gets rid of all of these like revenge deepfakes that are ruining people's lives. So things like that, regulations on how AI can be used and if it has to be fact checked, things like that. I think that is really important that even AI has to be held to it. Honestly, AI has to be held to a higher standard than humans because they have a broader scope of like people they can influence with their ideas. For example, a lot of people when they see something like the AI tells them, they'll automatically believe it. For example, the like Google AI overviews, but a lot of the time those things are wrong. And I feel like AI can be a really big source of misinformation or public education because it's accessible to mostly everyone, which means that people can be educated a lot faster. But the other issue is it can also spread misinformation really fast. So things like that. I think that AI can be used as a really great power or really great weakness, and it's up to us how we decide to wield it.
Well, it's very successful AI and misinformation. And it is purposely being used by leaders around the world, in our own country, because it is so successful at misleading people. How do you get around that? In other words, they have the money, they have the power to wield information and cause information. How do you surmount that?
Like I said, I think that legislation is really important. For example, like regulating what AI companies can and can't do. I think that's one of the best ways to kind of like put a bar around the scope of what AI can do and how like malicious it can be, if that makes sense.
And you've seen legislators you believe are actually moving toward that because they're interested in helping in that regard.
Yes, this is happening at both the national and the local level. In Texas, like I said, Representative Lalani in my own city in Austin has been passing legislation similar to this, and nothing like comes to mind directly at the national level, but I know the Trump's big beautiful bill is doing a lot of stuff with AI, some of which I don't really agree with, such as like removing all regulations, which I think kind of would let AI get completely off the guardrails. But I would like to see a lot more of what kind of legislation is coming out of the national level and like the pros and cons of both sides regarding AI.
Well, what are the biggest obstacles? Now, you mentioned that some youth believe that they really are informed because they're sharing things and that they are informed. I think a lot of Americans are similar. I have read what is coming into my news feed, so that must be true. What are, how do you convince them that what they're reading might not be true? In other words, there's an open-mindedness that you need to have to consider that you might be wrong and should maybe do more research.
A couple of things. I think that like actually just one thing, honestly. Like the main way to combat this is by talking to people from other parties. One of my closest friends used to be in the national chair of high school Republicans. He's going to college next year, and I've learned genuinely a lot from him. I've reached across the aisle and I've kind of learned a lot more of his policies on things like climate. And sometimes a lot of what he's saying makes sense. And a lot of things that he's said about things like election fraud and how a lot of we have different perspectives on what's going wrong on this country and how to solve it. But I think that like learning it from a facts-based standpoint rather than just like harsh rhetoric, I think that's really important. So I think that if more people would reach out and kind of like be open to hearing things from the opposite party, we would all learn a lot more. Like I think that I've moved a little bit closer to being on the middle of the aisle and being a lot more bipartisan through my work with Braver Angels and AYA and a bunch of other bipartisan organizations. And even just like when talking to my friends from other parties, like no one has like I'm a strong believer that no one really has a monopoly on good ideas, and bipartisanship and reaching out to people across the aisle is the best way to learn about that. For example, I was conducting interviews for high school Democrats recently, the Austin, Texas chapter. And a lot of the interviewees didn't really know what they were talking about. I was like, why are you a Democrat? And they genuinely couldn't give an answer out that wasn't outside the broad framework of I'm a good person. And I mean, like, obviously, not all Democrats are good people, and not all Republicans are bad people. Like, obviously, if that's how it worked, then everyone would want to be a Democrat. But that's not how it works. And I feel like a lot of those people, if they were exposed to what Republican ideas and values actually are, then a lot of them would be more willing to kind of consider being more bipartisan, things like that.
Would that put them at odds perhaps with their families though? And which would be a scary thing?
Do you mean like their families are the same party as them or their families are different
It,
parties?
it could be, for example, they have a family that's very much of one political persuasion and they come home and start talking about the other and, you know, whether that really is problematic for them.
Um, while it could get them into trouble, I feel like that is also one of the best ways to kind of disseminate ideas. For example, like if your parents are Republicans and you're a Democrat, or the other way around, you can come home and kind of like talk about ideas and talk about why they believe certain things. And I think that understanding that why is the key first step to like any sort of bipartisanship. Like you have to understand why people do things before thinking of solutions, right? Because different people see different issues with different things, right? And I think that like addressing those problems requires us to see things from the other perspective and kind of put ourselves in their shoes because everyone's life experiences have shaped them. And I think that like understanding those lived experiences and the perspectives that people have are really important.
Are you seeing a lot of polarization? Like, I assume that you, being in your political action, are around other like minds. But if you were to go to the more general population of those you go to school with and such, are you seeing a lot of polarization? And what form does it take?
Honestly, at school, I would say no, because at school, none of us are really that focused on politics. I think at my school, at least, I would say that I'm one of the most focused on politics, and everyone else is very like school, 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 grades, grades, grades. And I think that that's good because to an extent, I think that political partisanship is not great at schools, but I do think that a focus on academics at school is good. However, I do think that we should be able to talk about these ideas in the open without fearing what other people have to say. Right? Like I come from Austin, which is a liberal city in the center of a very, very Republican stronghold state, Texas. So, of course, a lot of the people I meet when I'm at the Capitol, when I'm across the state, and even across the nation, will have different political ideas than me. For example, just last summer, I was in DC and I found myself in a meeting with um, Senator Lummis from Wyoming, and I was learning a lot about her political beliefs and how she feels about campaign finance reform. And even though we come from completely opposite backgrounds and completely opposite political allegiances, we could find some common ground on the topic of campaign finance reform. So even if polarization is an issue, which it definitely is, it's one of the most important, massive issues that we've seen in a really long time. I think that there's a lot of small steps that we can do to combat it. So yes, I'm seeing a lot of polarization, but I'm also seeing a lot of great movements to kind of combat polarization, things like bipartisan bills across both parties, across both chambers, things like that.
Is there one in particular that has you hopeful? One
Um,
example?
I can't really think of a recent one, no, but I know that like a bunch of bills, for example, like the deepfakes one, in the Texas Senate and House was incredibly bipartisan, even if it wasn't necessarily co-sponsored. And I also remember the bipartisan Gun Prevention Act from 2021, which Senator Cornyn, a Republican sponsored common sense gun reform, alongside many, many Democrats. So that was another instance of bipartisan legislation that I can think of.
Are there other issues that you've been able to find common ground on with folks? You're talking about finance, campaign finance reform. You've talked about AI. Are there other issues that are near and dear to your heart that you're seeing movement on?
I think that common sense gun reform, i.e., like basic background checks, is pretty bipartisan. I think that background checks simply just make sense. Like, there's no reason not to have background checks, and both parties should be in favor of that. Beyond that, I think that it gets a little bit more split on what kinds of action should be taken for gun legislation. Things like mental health, things like the Second Amendment, all of those things come when all of those things come into play, the different parties decide to like they have different opinions on stuff like that. A couple of other things that I think are pretty bipartisan, I would say veterans benefits and veterans mental health care, stuff like that. I think that that's pretty bipartisan. And then one last thing that I think is bipartisan is probably things like infrastructure and education. I think that would be pretty bipartisan.
Well, when you're looking at all these issues and you're thinking about the people that you go to school with and other youth, are you seeing uh, a lot of them open to these ideas? Are you seeing them talk about these ideas that they're concerned too?
I think that at my school, no, but with other politically minded teenagers, for example, I was just at Girl State, I could see a lot of people introducing similar ideas into the Texas Girl State House and Senate. So things like that, I think that like people across both parties can agree that things like infrastructure, agriculture, education, things like that are all very, very important for people across the aisle since they're like fundamental necessities for America to like continue to thrive as a democracy. So things like that, I think that I've found to be pretty bipartisan across both parties. Yeah.
Well, what do you say to kids who are not politically involved? In other words, to energize them or engage them, or what arguments do you use? They're doing other things with their lives and whatnot. But what do you say?
I think that like even if they don't care about politics, politics definitely cares about them. And it's kind of like a get involved or be sidelined in the conversation kind of thing. So like I tell them to think like you're working, you drive to school, gas prices, things like that. higher education, costs of higher education. All of those things are very political issues. And even though they might not like seem so, like they're not in gun reform, they're not abortion rights, they're not anything like that, they're still like very influenced by the things that legislators bring into Congress. For example, I bring up the this amendment, sorry, this bill in Texas, which just passed and it requires the 10 commandments to be posted on the wall. And it's like, look, this is happening in our schools, right? It's like whether you're for it, whether you're against it, it's something political that is influencing us directly. And it's like if you choose to stay out of it, you don't really, you're kind of just being sidelined from not only history but politics as well. So those are like some of my main talking points when trying to convince people to stay politically involved. But like one thing I would say is Gen Z seems to be very politically involved. I feel like most people that I talk to are interested in the state of like global affairs and domestic affairs, regardless of if they know much, they would be interested in like getting to know, if that makes sense.
Mhm. You're encouraged by that, I'm assuming?
Yes, yes, that's very encouraging because even if people don't really know how to get started, which is something that's the main problem that I'm trying to tackle. People don't know how to gain this knowledge base. But they are interested in finding that knowledge base, which is incredibly important because like wanting it is half the journey.
Well, what do you recommend to them? Yeah, I come to you and I say, I would like to be more politically active, but I have no idea how to do it. What do you
Yeah,
say?
so especially for youth, and honestly, most of the people that I talk to about this are youth. I tell them, look, join your local high school Republicans or high school Democrats chapter. Join your state level, join your national level, and get involved there. The second thing is, I always think that legislation is the most important and easiest way to enact like actual change in our communities. So go to your city council, go to your school board, go to your legislators even and talk to them about issues that matter to you. One way to do this is phone banking, which I've done a lot of, and I've been kind of advertising to a lot of my friends and peers, which is just like calling up legislators and telling them how you feel about bills. And especially as constituents, this has a really big impact. So that's one of the best ways to get involved. And then also, I think that just educating yourself. So, what I do is every morning at the gym, I podcast for 45 minutes, and then the rest of the time, I just listen to music. But I'm always listening to the BBC's Global News podcast, which is really insightful. I've listened to a couple of episodes about the Iran Israel conflict, and they give live updates, and they're always very supported by facts. And so, that's something that I like to do. I think that listening to a podcast while you work is really important.
Well, it's very contentious news sources, and that's part of the polarization issue. So, BBC, I'm assuming you like it not only because you feel it's fair and accurate, but also it's foreign, and so therefore they have less stake in influencing our politics one way or the other. So, what do you say for kids who are, you know, nervous or not trusting news sources of one kind or another here in the US?
I mean, Google is free. You can always fact check anything that comes up on these sources. Like if they're making up numbers, they will get called out on it and people will stop listening to that podcast and you'll know about it.
Mm,
So I also think that there's this website called All Sides and there's a bunch
mhm.
of similar sites that will tell you that will show you the news across all sources, right? It'll say that okay, Republicans reported this, Democrats reported this and then the independents reported this and it'll show you like all the perspectives on an issue and so sometimes when I'm confused about something I'll definitely go there first.
Mm. Well, what do you think our political system can do to more successfully engage youth?
A couple of things. I think that like internships and more opportunities is really important. So right now I'm a democracy summer fellow for Jamie Raskin. And it's incredibly powerful to see a lot of people my age kind of getting involved and like and engaging in the political process, learning a lot more about things like voting rights and how to get more involved in government. I think that engaging with nonprofits is also really important. For example, She's in Gov different organizations are trying to get people put into power and kind of like teach them about how to run for office. One that comes to mind is runforsomething.com, which I've worked with a little bit in the past. It kind of sets people up for running for office in the Democratic Party. So that's something that's really important to me. I think that like working with organizations, just watching videos on YouTube, anything can like help you get more involved and engage in the political system, especially as young people.
Well, how are you feeling about America's ability to overcome overcome depolarization and help solve these problems? I mean, how are you feeling about it?
I'm very hopeful. I think that Gen Z has a unique ability to communicate our ideas, and I see a lot of bipartisanship. Even if there's a lot of polarization, we're still kind of like working around it by speaking to people across the aisle. At least like the main politicians or like aspiring politicians that I've talked to, really are trying to see both sides of the aisle and understand what the other party is thinking. I think that like the main thing that we should do is elect people who are depolarizing on the national level, i.e., people who don't use that harsh rhetoric and can kind of pull people together in times of need, not split us apart.
Hmm. Um, when are you going to vote for the first time?
I think my first time voting will be in 2026 or late 2020. No, it'll be 2026 because I won't be 18 until then. Yeah. So I'll be able to vote in the 2026 midterms, which will be really exciting because it'll be a contentious race between whoever the Democrat nominee is and honestly whoever the Republican nominee is. It'll be either Ken Paxton or Cornyn. So I'm looking forward to that, the Senate race, and then also like any other local municipal races that I can vote for. I've volunteered a lot on campaigns. I worked for Kamala's campaign, Colin Allred's campaign, and most recently Zoran's campaign in New York. So I'm very excited to be able to vote for the first time and kind of like put myself out there politically since I've been working for campaigns so long. Now I finally get to be on the like receiving end of those campaigns, if that makes sense.
Are you going to run for office at some point?
We'll see. I'm not sure because I want to go through undergrad and then I want to go through law school and then hopefully I'll be able to make a difference without running for office. But if that is the best venue to make a difference for me, then I definitely would be willing to run for office. I think my passion is really legislation. I've really enjoyed writing bills, debating bills, and kind of doing research on bills. So that's like something I'm very passionate about. So I want to go into something very policy oriented, whether that be like local or state or even national legislatures or more like diplomacy based organizations such as the UN or something of that sort. I'll have to see if I run for office though. I'm not really a huge fan of the campaigning.
Hmm. Do you believe that there's a large number of Americans who would pull together under a common ground movement, who are who share common ground and would like to see unity?
I believe so. I believe we can already kind of see it happening in legislatures. For example, when there's a bill introduced that's bipartisan, people rally together. For example, this isn't a bill, but the approval of Marco Rubio, the confirmation in the Senate, um, that is one instance where it was very bipartisan. Pretty much every single Democrat and Republican voted for him to be confirmed as Secretary of State. So when there is common ground, when both parties think that something is a good idea, then it will be voted for. And so I think that we can see bipartisanship, we can see people under a common ground movement in a way, kind of right now. And I look forward to seeing that in the future.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I have really appreciated it and have learned a lot myself. So, and thanks to again to all of you who listened to this episode. You can find the post and transcript of today's interview on my blog, vigilantpositivity.wordpress.com, and please join our cause. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just turn it off, and I will edit it out the end, and then it will say a proper thank you. Just a second. Okay. So thank you